Hey everyone, this is Kabane the Christian. So I want to do a pretty brief response to this video by Lane CH, and it's an upload of a clip from a debate on Calvinism versus Arminianism. Now, being Orthodox, I'm not an Arminian. However, in the places where Arminians disagree with Calvinists, I follow the Arminian side. So I do hold to libertarian free will. I do hold that God wishes to save the entire human race, every human person. I do not hold that God acts monergistically with respect to salvation, and so on and so forth. Now, but essentially there are two arguments here in this video. The first one is a philosophical argument, and the philosophical argument goes something like this. The libertarian position holds that in any given situation, with all things being as they are, a person has a range of choices which he can realize. That is, circumstances plus nature don't determine action. A person who chose evil could have chosen good. The circumstances plus his nature plus his inclinations did not necessitate that he chose evil. Now, the first thing I'd want to say about libertarianism is that I think that we presume libertarian free will, which I would just consider free will. We presume that as Christians whenever we build an ethical system. We don't hold that animals are ethically responsible, even though natural evil, in part, is the result of animals who act on their inclinations. A lion rips apart the children of another lion. Lions commit rape. But we don't hold that those lions are ethically responsible. Why? What differentiates them in principle from humans? I think what differentiates them is that humans have ethical libertarian freedom. But more importantly, I think the compatibilist argument here is circular, because the compatibilist says, because the libertarian holds that for any given set of circumstances, a person has a range of choices he can actualize, the compatibilist suggests that it's impossible to coherently speak of reasons that are choice-specific, because the set of circumstances is identical, irrespective of whatever choice a person makes. Now, the problem here is rather basic, and the problem is that the compatibilist is confusing two distinct things. Reasons are not causes. So the example our friend uses is that of a murder. A person who shoots another person, who pulls the trigger, would give a set of reasons for why he pulled the trigger. But our friend says that if he didn't pull the trigger, because the circumstances were identical, the reasons would likewise be identical. But this isn't true. For any given choice, there are reasons both for and against a choice. Let's consider something of less ethical weight. Let's say it's a Wednesday and thus a fast day, and a burger is set before me. I have reasons for eating that burger. Number one, I'm hungry. Number two, I enjoy burgers. Number three, it smells really good. Those are reasons for eating the burger, but there are also reasons against eating the burger. Namely, it's a fast day. I have to consider not my immediate desires, but rather my eternal salvation. Number three, I should love God above all things, including above food. So as you can see, there are reasons for both of these choices. Now, what differentiates one choice from the other is agency. As a person, I have the power, or the capacity, to cause a particular choice. And this is just the contention of libertarian free will itself. So the compatibilist, in trying to prove that libertarianism is philosophically incoherent, assumes compatibilism in advance. Because the position of compatibilism entails that a person's agency does not constitute a unique sort of cause. As such, the compatibilist is forced to hold that the only sorts of causes there are circumstances. But given that the libertarian doesn't agree with that, given that the libertarian thinks agency is a unique sort of cause, you can't use that to prove compatibilism. So essentially what I'm saying here is that reasons are distinct from causes, and that all things being equal in any given set of circumstances, you have a range of choices, and for each of those choices there are potential reasons, and the reasons for each choice are different. So a rational person, is capable in virtue of his rationality to deliberate upon his various choices and to actualize one of those choices among many. And so if you ask that person, why did you choose this and not that? They will give the reasons for that choice and not the potential reasons for any of the other choices. So as you can see, because reasons are not causes, the compatibilist argument fails to work. But there's a deeper problem here, because the compatibilist argument entails that libertarianism is not just false, it cannot be true. It is philosophically incoherent. And if libertarianism is philosophically incoherent, if it cannot be true, then God can no more have libertarian free will than he could create a square circle, because it entails a logical contradiction. The problem here is that everybody wants to hold that God has libertarian free will. We don't want to say that creation is entailed simply in virtue of God's nature, or else creation is metaphysically on par with God, because creation is simply an extension of God's being, a necessary extension, rather than a contingent expression of his overflowing love. The very contingency of creation hinges on our affirmation of libertarian free will. And that's a very important point, because if the compatibilist wants any of the philosophical arguments that the compatibilist will give will likewise apply to God. And this entails that if you want to affirm God as libertarian free will, all the philosophical arguments against libertarianism have to be false. The only response the compatibilists can really give to this is to say, well, it's a mystery. Well, a couple things here. First of all, mysteries are not a way of escaping logical contradictions. Okay, to just appeal to a mystery when you come to a logical contradiction is a cop-out. Theology is logically coherent. It might transcend our reason, but it doesn't contradict reason. Second of all, if you want to say that this concept of mystery is permissible, then I can just appeal to mystery in responding to all of your compatibilist arguments. If whenever one comes to a philosophical problem in one system, one can appeal to mystery, I can do it just like you can. So God's libertarian free choice entails that the compatibilist philosophical arguments must be false. Now, compatibilism might still be true with respect to humans, but it can't be necessarily true. Now, the second argument he makes is biblical, and he suggests that when we come to texts like Genesis 45 or Acts 2, whenever a biblical author speaks of God planning a particular thing which includes evil choices on the part of humans, this necessitates compatibilism, because it doesn't say that you chose this and then God turned that choice for good. Instead, it says that God intended this from the beginning. Now, I want to make a couple points in response to this. My first point is going to be a positive argument. I think Romans 9-11, which is a go-to text for Calvinists, I think Romans 9-11 actually teaches libertarianism, and it teaches against Calvinism. Not just that it's compatible with libertarianism, but that it actually does teach it. And here's why. This is going to be a really brief explanation. I've got longer articles that I've put out on my blog and on behalf of all on Ancient Faith Radio. But here's the short version of the argument. When Paul speaks of a potter and clay, when he speaks of the potter working at various vessels, some vessels for wrath and some vessels for mercy, Paul is not making this up. Paul is drawing from Jeremiah chapter 18. And the essential point is when you read Jeremiah 18, you find something really, really remarkable. In Jeremiah 18, God is working at his wheel, and the clay is Israel, and God is the potter. And God is working on this clay for a particular purpose. In other words, Israel is the vessel through which God accomplishes his purposes. But what's interesting is that the clay spoils in the potter's hand. It resists the working of the potter. As we can see, because this is an analogy, not everything that is true of clay is going to be true of humans, which is why Jeremiah includes an analogy to human freedom. The clay resists the hand of the potter. Therefore, the potter, God, reworks the clay for another purpose. Note how God actually responds to the free choice of humans. God is working at his wheel, and the clay resists God's purposes. It doesn't want to go along with it, but God still accomplishes his purpose through human beings by reworking that clay for another purpose. Now, one also sees this pop up in the way Paul talks about the potter and the clay in 2 Timothy. And let me just bring this up real quick because I'm doing this video off the cuff. 2 Timothy 2:20. Now, in a great house, there are not only vessels. Note how this word vessels is used. That's from Jeremiah 18, and it's used in Romans 9. Now, in a great house, there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honorable use, some for dishonorable. Those are words that are used in Romans 9, so Paul is talking about the same thing here. And here's what's really interesting. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honorable use. As you can see, the analogy between man and clay does not entail monergism. Paul includes in this analogy a place for human free choice understood in the libertarian sense. The doctrine that we're taught in Romans 9 to 11 is that whatever our choice, whether good or evil, God will accomplish his purpose through it. But he will accomplish his purpose through us in a way that blesses us if we cooperate, but in a way that curses us if we do not cooperate. And specifically, the clay in Romans 9 to 11 is Israel, according to the flesh. And what he says in Romans 11 is that the portion of the clay that resisted God, that was used by God, even though it resisted, was used by God in order to pile up sin in one place. That's what Romans 7 teaches, so that it means riches for the nations. That is why Paul says their trespass, and that's a word used in Romans 5 to talk about how the law increased the trespass, their trespass means riches for the world. It is because their trespass was used to deceive the serpent to coming into one place and attacking the Messiah. Their trespass meant riches for the nations. But, and this is essential, Paul says they did not stumble so that they might fall. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the nations so as to make them jealous, and thus he wants them to be fully included. Now, the key point here is that the Calvinist says they stumbled precisely so that they might fall, and so that their fall might be to the glory of God. But Paul explicitly contradicts that. Now, as for the clay that's used for an honorable purpose, as for the clay that cooperates with God, this is the part of Israel, the remnant according to the election of grace, the remnant that followed God and converted to Christ, and they are the dough offered as firstfruits, and the root which sanctifies the branches. In other words, it is because there was a remnant of Israel that the Gentiles can be grafted on to that history of Israel, because they are the means through which the Gentiles are grafted in. They are the historical link between Israel under the Old Covenant and Israel under the New Covenant, which is the church. So that is an essential point. I hope you can see my argument here, that Romans 9 to 11 actually tells us how sovereignty and libertarian free choice work together, because God accomplishes purpose whether or not we choose to follow him. Now, with respect to the texts he cites, I think he tries to press too much out of these texts, because what is being implicitly presumed when he interprets the text in a compatibilist sense is that God is somehow responding in time to our choices. And this is kind of an open theist concept of God, as if God sees our choices in time and then has to deliberate how to respond. But in reality, when God creates the world, he sees all of the choices that will be made, not because circumstances necessitate them. In other words, he doesn't deduce our choices from the circumstances, but because he is present to each moment, he sees the choices. And in the very act of creation, God has a purpose and a plan for every evil choice that is made. Because he has to, even though he doesn't cause those choices, he nevertheless allows them. and turns them to the purpose of his will. So the essential point here is that it's not as if God is deliberating and responding in time, it's that God in the act of creation sees all choices that will be made and includes them from the very beginning in his sovereign plan to unite all things in Christ. So I hope this video has been helpful to you in exploring the philosophical and biblical dimensions of the problem. And I hope I've shown you that even if compatibilism is true, there's nothing philosophically that makes it necessarily true. I hope I've also shown you that Scripture does not necessarily teach compatibilism. In fact, in Romans 9-11 it teaches against it. Thank you very much for listening.